Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Cherub, and I'm from the Center for Livable Cities. I'll be your MC for today's lecture. For those of you who are new to us, or this is your first time attending a CLC lecture, the center was jointly established by the Ministry of National Development and the Ministry of the Environment and Water Resources in 2008 to distill, create, and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. The CLC lecture series is one of the platforms through which urban thought leaders share best practices as well as exchange ideas and experiences. Today, we have the honor of having Prof Yong Kwet Yew, a respected authority on today's subject matter, to share his research on underground land use in Singapore. He will cover some of the challenges as well as key drivers affecting its development and what can be learned by studying creative use of subterranean spaces worldwide. Prof Yong is Professor of Civil Engineering and Senior Vice President at the National University of Singapore. He's an expert in the field of geotechnical engineering, tunneling, and underground construction. He's also the scientific lead and co-chair of the Ministry of National Development and the National Research Foundation's Land and Livability R&D Committee, which has a focus on space and sustainability. Prof Yong also chairs several professional and government committees, including the International Panel of Advisors to the Land Transport Authority. And on top of that, he's also my senior from the University of Sheffield, UK. Of course, there's a huge gap in between. So today's format for the lecture will start off with a presentation by Prof Yong, followed by a short sharing by each of the panelists, and then the panel discussion before a Q&A session with the audience. We are honored to have quite a good panel today, in fact, very good panel today, with two panelists which each have a huge stake in this field. We have Ms. Adele Tan, who is the Group Director of Strategic Planning at URA, the Urban Redevelopment Authority, responsible for long-term land use planning for Singapore. And we also have Mr. Peter Stones, a senior engineer with Arab. He co-authored the Underground Space Development Key Planning Factors following a benchmarking study with URA, informing the development of Singapore's future underground space master plan. The discussion as well as the Q&A session will be moderated by Dr. Hossein Reza, Director of Web Structures, Singapore and Milan Research Lab, who is also the first engineer to win the Designer of the Year award at the President's Designer Award 2016. We would like to encourage the audience to kindly hold all questions till the Q&A session. Thank you. So without further ado, let's welcome Prof Yong to the stage.
Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me just introduce myself in the topic. First of all, let me thank the Mr. Khoo Teng Chai and the CLC for letting me be part of this CLC lecture series. When I thought about the title, the first thing that the staff from CLC, the only tip they actually asked me to do is don't make it too technical, so they scared I'll put all the formulas about how to make sure underground stability and so on. But I thought that rethink and I took this opportunity is to try to demystify underground. Maybe because I've been involved in the development, all my research actually has been a microcosm of the national development in Singapore. Been first involved with reclamation, ground improvement, then later on to power foundation, this excavation, and the last 30 years has always been in tunneling and excavation. The 40 years, of course, I've been intimately involved in the development of Singapore, and the last 30 years was beyond tunneling and underground excavation, underground construction. And with that, of course, you find that I put this not to show exactly what I'm doing, but basically to give you the perspective in which this lecture is going to be based on. The first two positions that I hold, first as a professor in the National University, and as a chairman of International Panel Advisors, provide me the depth of real technical knowledge and a background on what underground construction is all about. My second and third, which is Development Project Advisory Panel, and the COSITE and the R&D Committee, both provide me the breadth. So I have a depth and the breadth. That breadth actually in the development project, basically the panel actually oversees many of the major infrastructure. And then as a co-chair of the Livable R&D committee, first on the land and livability, we look at land from the space of space creation. We look at livability from the point of view of the of quality of life and so on. And then, of course, from the land and livability, we move on to the City of Tomorrow's program, which is essentially on urban solutions. And both of them give me the perspective that it is not just engineering that matters in underground. There's a social, economic, and societal dimension in the use of underground space. So with that, this is roughly the area of my topic. I have something like 40 slides. That's way more than what I normally would want to do and teach. Usually, I like to just keep to a slide per minute. But essentially, what you see is that because I have not written any paper to go with the slides, so the slides encompass a lot more details because you can still read the slides through the CLC website and so on. Now, basically, the topics, and then the slides that you see, those that are very busy slides. I'm not going to go through all of them. You take your time to read it. It's just a snapshot of what it is. But those that I need you to pay attention, they come in little point-by-point form. Now, the topics I intend to do is something that is not new to many of you. I'm sure each of you will have your own little role and experience in some of this one. Much of it you can even Google when you look about the examples of underground project, you can find it. But what I hope in this lecture is actually to stitch all the little parts and play that is involved in underground into a narrative that I intend to do in the presentation, starting from why underground, examples of underground projects, space planning, tunnel talking points, what's next for Singapore, my own vision, but this from an engineer's perspective, okay? Now, on underground, on covering the underground, there's a vast amount of literature. As I say, it's not new. You know, you find that the latest, of course, is the Underground Spaces Unveiled. I suggest that this is a must read if you're interested in underground planning in space. This was done written by both Hans Emerald and Antonio Comaro. Both are actually active members in the International Tunneling and Underground Space Association, in which there's actually a committee called the ITACAS, which is International Tunneling Association Committee of Underground Space. Then you also have several journals that you can have underground space, but all of these generally tend to cover countries in the European and in the Western Hemisphere. Not many actually cover a lot of things that is inherent and intrinsic with Singapore. So we have three societies here: Tunneling Underground Construction Singapore, Geotechnical Society of Singapore, and the Singapore Rock Mechanics Engineering Geology. And that's where they actually organize regular symposium about tunneling and underground construction in Singapore, for which you can actually find a lot of local information on this one. Then, of course, we also have recently the Arabs been commissioned to do a benchmarking study and establishment of guidelines for underground space planning, submitted to URA, from which actually they organized an exhibition called Underground Singapore Next Frontier. For those who do not have this, you can always go into the URA website. The documents are all available. Even in Hong Kong, they also have a Cities Without Ground, some guidelines on this. So literature abound. So it's nothing that is, perhaps unless you actually work on it, you still find that there's something uncertain and unusual about underground. So as we start to move from the knowledge base, where we actually have a lot of those information, what do you mean by underground and why underground? So first of all, I'd like to take you through the perspective of Singapore. We are basically a finite land area of 700 square kilometer land and 700 square kilometers. So this is our boundary, total 1,400. And that is finite, okay? That is finite. We have challenging geology, soil rock, so 2/3 of it, we have basically rocks near the outcrop, near the surface area. Another 1/3, basically the rock is further down. But nevertheless, as far as we are concerned, as far as I'm concerned as an engineer, the whole island, it's actually on rock anyway. It's just what is above the rock, whether you have weathered material or you have what we call the yellow part, which is the soft formation, or the orange part, which is called old alluvium, but they're basically stiff, dense sand and stiff clay into it. Now, so they are challenging geology, but it's not that we do not know. There's a lot of work done over, so much work due to LTE works, Singapore Power works, that basically anything that we need to know about the conditions in the island, I think we are very familiar. what we do not know, and which is going to be taken up by the underground geological survey, is going deeper beyond the usual 50 meters that we do in exploration. Now, the other perspective that you need to know is that, fortunately, we don't have typhoons, but we do have strong winds, called Sumatras. We don't have earthquakes, but we have far-field seismic response. But this far-field response is not something that is actually very serious unless there's a 7 magnitude, 7.0 magnitude earthquake, 400 kilometers from Singapore. That's where we will feel something. Anything beyond that, or anything that's a low magnitude, in general, we don't really do it. But even with there's a seismic response, my best advice, in fact, I've done a lot of projects in Jakarta. Our advice is always is in Jakarta, seismic area, you just build basement. Basement, actually, not many people know, actually is the safest place to hide when there was an earthquake. If you find that any earthquake that's damaged, always with the structures above it. Very rare do they have a damage in the basement. But your basement, you also are subjected to liquefaction. But liquefaction, we know, usually takes place the first 5 meters, 10 meters, sometimes most is 50 meters. So build a 20-meter basement. And you find that actually a basement that's surrounded by soil and so on is certainly more robust and stable than your very slender building it during an earthquake situation. So no big deal. Singapore have a lot of the buildings on basement, and that shouldn't be a problem. We don't have a tsunami. Our tide, in fact, is actually at the most a couple of meters, compared to places like those in the open sea, like Korea and Japan, where the wave height can go to as high as 10 meters. So you need very substantial sea defense wall. But we have 40% lowlands, and so because of climate action, about the concern about rising seawall, there's another study being done on adaptive the coastal areas. But we do have plenty of rain, extreme rainfall events nowadays, high density, short duration. We are getting hotter, we have drought events. And these are all problems that is not insurmountable. There are solutions, it's only on how we intend to overcome some of these problems. But a lot of people say that we don't have resources, but we do have resources. We have plenty of sand. Okay, they are all in this part of the western part. There's a lot more sand we want to mine, but of course, they're also in the way of development. Then we also have aggregates that can come from all the rocks that you intend to mine. You excavate into all the underground, you provide a lot of aggregates. And then we have plenty of water. This comes from our rain, but we don't collect enough of them. And then, of course, we have plenty of sun. Okay? We should look at this natural resource and see how we can leverage it, really, rather than say that Singapore has no resources. But Singapore is a small island, but we have big needs. So let me just clarify between the city-state and one where it's a city in a country. Let's take London, for example. If London needs to have an airport, London have an old London City airport, but we need to extend, you just build outside of London in Heathrow. Singapore, your airport, your port, your defense, commerce, everything must occur in our 1,400 square meter of sea space and land space. So it's a very tall order to try to accommodate all of these, where many of the cities worldwide have a lot of hinterland for them to actually grow, put all the other non-essential things. And because of that importance, there was a interministerial committee on sustainable development in 2009. First of all, the motivation is a lively and livable Singapore. And what were the strategies for sustainable growth? So the key strategies, one of the key strategies, apart from all the other economic direction, is basically how to expand land resource. Go higher, go wider, go deeper. Go higher, we're beginning to see HDB building up 40, 50-story blocks of building. In the past, it was up to 20 meters, 20 stories. And go wider, basically, we have reclaimed more than 25% of our land in beyond since we first started reclamation, 1822. First reclamation was in Telok Ayer. And then we were to look at all these areas down here. The pink are those that are already land reclaimed as of end 2015. And then the rest are potential areas to reclaim. But as many of us know, basically we're having a problem with with sand supply. So the difficulty of getting sand is challenging our ability to complete the reclamation. And then under the NRF as well as the NIC project, we've been looking at other alternatives, methods of reclaiming sand, including even possibility floating platforms and so on. Now we go deeper. As I said, when you want to go deep, it's unlimited. You can go down the center of the earth if you want, but it's unlimited. So really, it is And I'll tell you the reasons, what are the challenges if you want to go underground. But basically, this is our deepest facility. That is the Jurong Rock Cavern, 130 meters beneath the seabed in Jurong Island. And this cavern is as tall as a 9-story building to store hydrocarbons into it. Now, my definition of underground, many people when talk about underground seem to only associate it with cavern. No, to me, my definition of underground is anything beneath the ground. And right now, it's a very structured procedure, although we still don't have an underground master plan before, but in some way, we do have some structured guidance on where we put in our underground facilities. Utilities are generally in the top 3 meters. Our shopping malls and other parcels up to about 12 meters, sometimes deeper for 3 to 4 stock basements. Expressway 825, and generally they tend to be higher than the MRT because you need ramps to get into it. So the deeper you put it, the more ramps, more land take. So you try to put your expressway or your road tunnel as much as possible to the near surface. But for the MRT system, you can actually use elevator to transport people down in stations, so you can put that deeper. You don't need ramps to actually bring things above to the ground. And then below the MRT, you'll be 20 to 55 meters, your deep tunnel. The main tunnel trunk is usually in the 40 to 50 meters. The 20 meters are the link sewers that try to connect everything into the main tunnel. Then you have the Singapore Power cable about 60 meters down. And then we have 2 cavern projects. The first is the underground ammunition facility, and this is actually in granite. And then in the Jurong Rock Cavern, this is in what we call sedimentary rock. So we are done on both of the rock formation in Singapore to show that both are actually possible. But again, the purpose for both of these going very deep down is because they're looking at the quality of the rock. As we know more and more about it, there's nothing to say that we cannot have underground structures anywhere. Sorry, oops. We cannot have anywhere between this area down here. And in fact, the possibility of even constructing even in soft material is now being researched at the university in NUS, where we look at how can you treat those areas to actually make it usable for underground use. So let me just take you to some of the other underground projects. Now, I will ask many times, how ahead of the curve is Singapore in terms of global underground space here? We are very far behind. We are very behind because everybody cite cost as a reason for not going underground. And I think that there has to be some mindset change into what are the possibilities in going underground because everywhere else in the world, they're already doing it. Okay, so we are far behind. You see from some of the examples I'm going to give you to show how far behind, but at the same time, I'm also showing some of the projects we actually have done. Thanks to the History Channel, this again, you can easily find that we already have underground cities as early as 8th century. You see, you go to Turkey, there are 36 underground cities. The biggest, of course, is Derinkuyu, underground city, and you find that that Derinkuyu actually can take 20,000 population up to a depth of 85 meters. This is typical of it. They're able to do it because they have volcanic rock, what we call in engineering terms the soft rock. Soft rock is easy to excavate and it's quite stable in that respect. Okay, so these are covered from, but most of the underground facilities in those early days are always as a refuge for war and invasion. And so if you go into the second one, I only show for the purpose just to give a lighthearted to it that you also have this Pilsen, which is used for storage, but they also use an escape route. Now the reason why I show that is because for those who love beer, this is the pilgrimage city I see. You should go. The biggest beer drinkers are not in Australia and Germany. They're actually in the Czech Republic in Pilsen. That's why you go down there, they drink beer as if they were drinking water. Okay. And you should make in Prague, nice place to go to Prague if you have not been there, but go and visit Pilsen. It's a very nice place for you to visit. Then in the Cold War, we have underground bunkers. Okay, the British built the Burlington bunkers. The Beijing has an underground city, not many people know. They opened it up for public viewing in 2000 and 2005, but they closed it up in 2005 for 2 reasons. One, it's been used by homeless people. 2, for security reasons, they decided to actually enclose and seal up all the underground city bunkers. But they are not small. These bunkers are big. They are 30 meters deep, can hold 4,000. In the case of Beijing, it's even bigger, 85,000 square kilometers, and 300,000 people can hold. And some say even up to 1 million. But the good thing, of course, is that they are not used and they don't have to be used, and that's interesting. But I'm just showing 2 examples. But everywhere in the world, I'm quite sure even in Singapore, every country will have some bunkers outside for defense purpose in the case of some attacks and so on. And so this is one of the use. That's already been used common in every country. You go to Russia, they're full of it. And the biggest number of bunkers that I'm aware of is actually in Middle East. You know, their bunkers are so huge that they have hospitals, they have schools, they have everything that you need to survive if there's an air attack. Modern day underground city, I just highlight, there are many examples, but I just highlight Montreal because it's best well known. This is Reso. Reso is just basically a French for network of connection, a network of tunnels. Now this is basically one of the biggest, and all they did was just to try to link up all the basements of all the Montreal underground. 500,000 people spread over 4 square kilometers. This is roughly the space, I work it out, roughly the space between Orchard and Marina Bay, all the area together. This is about 4 square kilometers. Now, the important thing about it is that it is actually a place where the community look forward to. It's a place to escape the winter cold in Montreal. And so this is something that has been used very widely. And you can look at it, you know, even it's underground, through clever engineering, you bring daylight, you still have trees. Nobody says you can have undergrounds and trees. And then, of course, you can have skylight that coming, dropping down into the underground. So all these can be done. Another city that has been known to have a lot of, and they have an underground plan, is Helsinki in Finland. And here's where the geological formation is no different from us. The sedimentary rocks, they have granite. They also have a top layer of what we call recent deposit, which is soft material. But in Helsinki, what they do, what they have and we don't have is that all the rocks are actually at the surface, near to the surface, or at the outcrop. So like you can see in this one, the sports stadium here, half of it is above ground, half of it is all below ground, which you see in this ice skating down here. So this is actually, in the case of Helsinki, there's a use. But the other use is actually it's a better way to control temperature, really. And then, of course, many countries now, because of the climate change, because of the high intensity of rainfall, everyone is building underground stormwater drainage. You know, the Hong Kong West Drainage Tunnel, basically at the deep, they're trying to take away most of the runoff from the hills to actually into an area that doesn't go to the city and flood the city. Tokyo already have the GCANS project. Basically, they have an underground tunnel, 6.4 kilometers, linking down several silos, 5 silos, where they collect water from all the areas. Then they bring it into one huge tank called the temple. That's where they actually store the water. I think there's something that I understand PUB is looking into it, and I think they should. Rather than we widen the canal or deepen the existing surface canal, we should try to actually put all the groundwater, stormwater under drainage. And we're already done with the deep tunnel sewage system, and there's nothing to say that we cannot do a similar one for the stormwater system. But the country that's leading in all under construction is actually China. In the past, many of the technologies that we've used in Singapore came from Europe, then came from Japan and Korea. They were all doing an underground. And then more recently now, much of the technologies and the new ideas are all coming up from in China. You go to any of they have 65 cities that they're going to build metros all along. And many of the cities are actually expanding vertically. They have found that many of the cities that expanding laterally has its own issues of transportation and other issues. So they're beginning to go vertically. Many of the cities are also having underground master plan. And some of it, like happened to be in China for the, as one of the technical advisor to the Shanghai Municipal Commission that looks on the use of underground space and so on. And when I was there, they shared with me that they had this problem that in some of the lines, Shanghai is so developed, they can't find anywhere to put the station. What did they do? They buy up basements within the, shopping, some areas, and they convert it into underground station. You know, rather than build another station, they just buy out what is available in those basement commercial, and then they convert it into underground station. And 2 of the stations are now being converted from formerly commercial complexes. And the deepest underground facility that I know of is about 2.5 kilometers. This is actually in China, in the Qinping Mountain. And this is where the deepest underground facilities for research on astroparticle research. This has already been completed, 2.4 kilometers. This is the deepest that I know of. But again, in the case of China, they do everything big. Okay. So the presidency has announced, and this was reported in the South China Post in June 2017, they're going to embark on a mega city in Xiongnan in Hebei. Hebei is basically all around, you extract Beijing and you extract Tianjin out of this. There's the whole province of Hebei is there. And they are looking at there are two levels, one at 26 meters and one at 40 meters. Where they are shallow, they call 26 meters, they put the storage, shopping, parking, everything. At the 40 meters, they're going to put water storage, key infrastructure, and of course, defense facility again. So this actually is Xiongnan, actually near to Beijing. So it's easy if, again, these are all in preparation. If there are any unintended attack and so on, they just go into the Xiongnan mega city. But otherwise, in a normal day-to-day, it's still going to be a city by itself. And that's where, when you start to go into this, they are actually bringing new technologies and new construction techniques into the world. And I hope, of course, that this underground development has been done, and Arabs actually compile what are the things that have been done over and give a chronological period. But I'll leave to, because Peter is one of the panelists, I'll leave to him to expand on this, and I will not be talking too much about this other than my own experience and underground project in Singapore. And of course, I've been involved with the LTA, both as a board member, and which I've stepped down, and then for over 12 years as the chair of the IPA, the International Panel of Advisors, where we basically look at all the geotechnical and construction issues in our LTA projects. So it's an international advisory panel where we also learn from what the rest of the world is doing. And this is one of the bigger use of underground space in Singapore is our rail transport system. And Bencoolen right now is actually the deepest station at 45 meters. Now then I'm involved in some LAM optimization. The next 3 slides shows on the LAM optimization efforts at a whole of governmental level. The first was, the earlier one was underground ammunition storage. If I can just take you through very quickly, of course, this is all driven by Professor Louis when he was the chief defense scientist in MINDEF. Before then, the ammunition was stored in an area where we had to sterilize 1,000 hectares of land because if there's explosion, you cannot reach the neighborhood, so that you have to sterilize 1,000 hectares of land. And then we decided to put it underground. The current rules and underground storage standards for explosives, this was from the West, shows that we need an area about 240 hectares to put everything underground. Then Prof Liu, together with these engineers, together with the NUS and NTU, we started to do a series of research pertinent to our local condition. And what we're able to do is that finally our ammunition only require a footprint of 100 hectares. And one of the interesting findings, of course, is that we found that actually water is the best defense against any explosive waves. Any of those explosion energy waves that come up for any explosion, water is a very good dampener. And that actually formed the whole basis of design for this underground. Of course, we had to do a lot of simulation. We did tests in both Norway and in Australia just to show how things work and so on. Of course, the rest of it, including even the defense, the gate and all these were all tested to do this. And so finally, we only need a footprint of 100 hectares. And that is underground. And we therefore free up all the 1,000 hectares above ground. And this is what you see in the underground. It can be as pleasant as you want it to be. The second project we've done is the underground oil storage. This is the Jurong Rock Cavern, completed around operational around 2013. There's another phase going on, I understand. And basically, you can see down here, these are the storage in the above ground, which occupies a lot of space. You put this storage all below ground, you free up a lot of land for your other kind of surface kind of activities that's needed. On top of that, you're actually saving, you're improving security, you're also improving health and safety in this area. And this is actually the completed GRC. LAM optimization too, we're putting all our cables very deep. So this is the higher voltage which is I was involved. And basically, because we did not have the 2015 Parliament Act to pass some type of law at that time, they had to basically follow all the expressway. This following the CTE, following the AYE, in terms of they have to follow under the roads. Unlike the MRT, where the the easement right, where they can go underneath buildings, the cable tunnels didn't have at that stage this opportunity. But things have changed with the 2015 Act of Parliament. And so essentially, this is 35 kilometers of cable tunnel, 50 to 60 meters deep, and then they generally go very deep below all the infrastructure. And this is what it looks now today inside. You cannot tell the difference between whether this is 60 meters or this is actually 10 meters below the ground. And essentially, they are trying to move a lot of it, but there are still those surface utilities that we have that I think we are not doing much about it. The last land optimization is the deep tunnel sewage system. And then you can see that basically this is now going on the phase 2. Phase 1, we have actually completed. Phase 1 is around this area. Phase 2 now is actually from this area onto this area. Basically, again, this is just putting everything underground so that it does not cause disruption at the surface. And these are the things that you don't need people, you only need to send in maintenance crew, and these are facilities and things that can actually go underground. And of course, we're also expanding all the metro. There are lines that are indicated here. Currently in construction is the Thomson East, but then we are going to have the Cross Island Line, Jurong Regional Line, extension to Circle Line, Downtown Line, Northeast Line, and a couple more lines are being considered, because if we need to go on to the vision that we want to have 8 out of 10 homes to within 400 meters of the station, then you need a lot more lines to cover more parts of Singapore. Now, the other part of it, of course, is that as we have more and more lines, I just have a very simple slide here to show that when you start to look at all these, you have the Northeast Line, you have the Viaduct, Keppel Viaduct, you have the DTS, you have the Circle Line, and you have actually a lot of infrastructure. So in fact, actually, the underground is really crowded. And the only way, we can all build this engineering-wise, but it costs a lot of money to just try to protect the existing structure in order for you to build the new structure. And this could have been perhaps been saved if we actually now talk about underground space planning. And this is something that the government is well aware of it, and they started doing this at least 5 to 8 years ago on this underground space planning. Now, the way the URA has planned is that they have this concept plan, and then they have this 5-year regular review of the Master Plan Committee that governs all the development in Singapore for 5-year time frame. Then you have the Community Facilities and Coordinating Committee that looks at the whole government approach. And then, of course, the recent one is underground. You have Underground Masterplan Task Force led by the MND. And then you also have Advanced Planning Interagency Coordination of Future Master Plan. Now, I'd like to show this slide mainly from the fact that, by the way, if any one of you out there know where this information came from, I'd like to put it as a source of information. I took it out somewhere and I forgot where exactly. I tried to trace all the papers I read. I don't know where it came from. But if you are one of those original, please let me know where they are, so at least I can due credit to the author of this. But what I like at this picture is to show what I hope one day we'll be able to do this. We don't have to now, currently what we're doing, build underground highway, MRT tunnel, deep tunnel. They're all separate tunnel taking up unnecessary space. This is a tunnel that I hope you call it the mother of all tunnels, You put everything all into one, and they can shed space there, And I only need to do tunneling once, disturb people once, and then I can find the right depth, but I can meet all the requirements. But these kind of things have been done very, very early, at the real planning stage, before even we need it. Because by the time, if you want to go into all this, the reason why we have to allow each of these is because everyone came in very late, all for strategic reasons. If they don't finish by this time, something's going to happen to the country, So we just carry on building. So I think what we need to do is really, at some point of time, decide that if I'm going to have a master plan with a big tunnel, who wants to build your facilities inside? No difference from our common services tunnel that you see in the Marina Bay. Nobody wants it, but once it's done, everybody wants to put their thing inside it. Now, this is where the 3D master plan now, because Adelie is here, I will leave some airtime for her to talk a bit more, but this is just a snapshot to show that there are a few initiatives going on space planning. One, of course, the 3D master plan. The same thing, they're trying to integrate the above structure with the below. And more important is how to safeguard corridors and safeguard vertical access. I can do anything underground, but first I must be able to get a vertical access to get to where I have to go before I can start all my construction. So that vertical access is very important. So what they're trying to do is safeguard areas, safeguard places for access and so on. And then of course in here they try to have all these kind of, roughly what are the kind of type of structure that can actually go underground. And then of course this is in 2013 I believe, the British Geological Survey was commissioned to do the 3D model of our bedrock. The geology of Singapore was done in '76. In fact, the earlier geology was done by the British in 1925. That was where you have the first proximate geology. But when Public Works Department then did a comprehensive geology of Singapore, then it was updated by the DSTA in 2009. And then after the Interministerial Committee that looks at the space is important, they set up a Singapore Geology Office in 2010, headed by Kiefer Chiam from the BC, who then basically look over the last 5, 6 years or so on, looking at this, and this is completed. Now they're going through a state of industry consultation, or what they call socialization. And then, of course, this has been done, and that will, I hope the underground planners, the URA will take into consideration what kind of geological profile suits what kind of activities. And then we are also in the lab by the NRF and so on, is to try to create a virtual 3D Singapore. So we have various agencies doing it, URA, SLA. The university here, the NUS has done its 3D virtual NUS campus, we have done it. Again, those are all things that the tools that are useful for planning and decision making and so on. But the challenge, of course, is how do I integrate the underground master plan, the geological map, and the virtual Singapore into one. Those things are considered very exciting, but I think nobody seems to know how maybe Adelaide can share something about how we're going to integrate all these three things together. Now, my final talking points are basically just to probe discussion at the panel session. Okay, these are not necessarily that I have answers to all these, but I thought these are relevant from my perspective. First of all, legal planning and framework. In preceding the Singapore Parliament, I had several meetings with the Ministry of Law, MinLaw, and particularly with the Dam Pump Sec based on Jin, to look at how can we actually, what makes sense for us to have a law on underground use. So Singapore Parliament amended 2 laws to facilitate underground development. First is the State Lands Act. This is amended so that in the past, Singapore followed the British common law. In the past, whatever you own your land, anything all the way to the center of the earth is actually your land. Okay, you can do anything you want, but with this act now, you own only up to Okay, with this, you only own up to 30 meters under the ground. Below the 30 meters, the government has the right to do it. Then they also have the Land Acquisition Act. Between 0 and 30 meters, if they didn't need to pass through somewhere, for example, they are not below, assuming that this is a 30-meter datum where they can do anything underground, they can actually buy up your surface land and specific strata for doing that. But there lies another thing which I'm challenging the legal and the planners to think about. As I say, in China, I gave an example earlier on, that they basically now have station that runs into commercial buildings. They buy up the basement, convert it into station, because within all the urbanized area, they just can't find another space to build a station. And 2 of that commercial buildings are being converted now to underground as part of the Shanghai Metro. Which act it falls under currently is not clear there. I don't think there's any even to, and unless you allow that in your act, this thing is not going to happen. But at some point of time, we may soon run out of place in the urbanized area, that sometimes it makes sense instead of acquiring land or kick people out, it's just to integrate the development basically with our infrastructure system. And much of this is not very different from the Japan. In fact, the 30 meters really is also reflected in the Japan special measure for public use of deep underground. In that place, they also mentioned that anything below 30 meters belongs to the government. The same way that they started to realize that challenges that they face, and then we only came in later, but we had the benefit that was already done in Japan. The other part, which is actually very abstract, very difficult, but nevertheless worth always discussing, the social dimension of quality of life and taboo of living. Now, the quality of life is something that is what is expectations, not now, but in future, And then the taboo about living underground. But what I show down here, although it's a cave dwelling, it's actually, you go to Xiamen, you see this. Okay, there are about 3,000 people living in subterranean city, partly because it is warm during winter, it's cool during summer. All right? So they have their own inherent initiative for why they think that living in this is actually important. So to me, taboo is actually, again, in a mindset, Then the behavior and psychological impact on humans living on underground or living or working long hours. Okay, this concern. Personally, I see there's no different from a person working in a basement room without windows. And unfortunately, we do have a lot of places where the rooms does not have windows, But I thought I'd share with you 2 interesting things. Lund University, they've done a study, but this is done people working in the room without windows and without. They find the decision-making process between people working above ground and with daylight against are quite same. instead of you reading the whole thesis, you can go and read if you want. I'll just give a very simple final finding. The finding is that it's the glass half full or half empty. The guy that works with the window is always a half full guy. The guy that works without windows and without daylight is a half empty guy. So you can draw your own conclusion from that. Now then, the Journal of Sleep Medicine, they say that workers in windowless room or with little daylight exposure, they tend to lose about 45 minutes of sleep. That is because you are off your circadian rhythm. Now, your biological clock is all changed, and so it takes time for you to, stay around in bed before you really actually fall asleep. This is clinical is actually the Journal of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. Technical challenges, and that's coming from an engineer's perspective now. Basically, we have to differentiate again between Singapore's underground challenge, which is an urban underground. It's different from places where people have plenty of rocks, hills everywhere, where there's no buildings or things nearby. We are in an urban environment. So our space actually is underground urban space. But the technical constraints and challenges in underground construction, whether in rock or in source, are not insurmountable. We have solution for everything. You give me time and money, I can solve any problem you want. But the challenge is that once it's built, you cannot go for all those en bloc sales anymore, Keep on changing the use of it, because once it's built, they're very hard to actually tear it down. So you actually either have to design for permanency, or you have to design for a high degree of flexibility. Okay? Now, from the engineering perspective, there's really no limit to how much underground space, including those below our seabed, could be potentially exploited. They've done a lot of projects. I don't know. The only thing, of course, you have to handle, which I'm going to mention later, is just water and other problems that you need to work. The limit often lies in our economic and commercial viability of the project. Full stop, that's all. It's just developers and government, they're all just driven by the fact that there is a cost to building underground. So that's where it leads me to talk about construction costs now. Now, the high construction, these are generally 2 to 5 times. Now, sometimes if you're actually near if your rock is near the surface, it can even be less than 2 times. The reason is, how do you provide the access to go in? This costs money. How big is your facility, and your geology in that area in which actually will determine the amount of measures you need to put in there. So generally, our part is 2 to 5 times. This is not very different from our own rule of thumb, having been a developer in the university. It's 1:3:5 ratio for car parks. Surface car park, if it costs $1, it costs $3 if I build a multi-story. It costs me $5 if I put it as a basement car park. That's essentially what it is. So that is not too far from this construction cost is actually indicated down here. But if land prices, bear in mind that 30, 40 years ago, land price is only 10 to 20%, construction was about 80%. Now it's the reverse. Land price is close to 60 to 70%, construction is just 20 to 30%. Now, if we get more and more like Tokyo in the Ginza area, your land cost will be so expensive that now Taisei submitted a proposal to build up to 30 meters, because that is the limit of what they own the land. And that's about 8 to 10 stories below the ground. So that will actually, when the land price becomes very, very expensive, it makes sense to go as high as you can, to make sense to go as low as you can. The land price may not be now, but you talk about 50 to 100 years from now. The construction, if we continue the way we are, will probably be low compared to the cost of actually your land. Then the higher cost is compensated by saving in facade. In underground, you don't talk about facade, you don't talk construction maintenance. And in a lot of cases, it's been proven to studies that you actually have lower energy consumption as well. And so this 12% is just thrown in because it came from a figure that we did some estimate early on. But basically, this is actually, part of the reason is because you don't have to have an intake of a lot of these intake. The environment, local environment itself is actually sufficiently, doesn't have that solar gain that you have building that is exposed to the sun. Okay. Then must address additional institutional economic barriers. Public sector should see the higher costs as a trade-off with gaining land, of course, better environment. You put a lot of the non-required things underground, you basically can have a much better quality of life above ground. And for the private sector, I think this development charge must be addressed. Talking point 5, risk in underground development. First of all, the biggest challenge we have in underground is how to keep the water out, okay, during construction and during the life of that structure. So seepage of water leading to, if not, then you have water drawdown, and that leads to some settlement around the area, or you change the environment condition. The other, of course, is the air quality in the underground. Unlike above ground, I can just open my window, the fresh air will come in. You cannot open anything under the ground. No air will come, only the water will come in. And then you have the high humidity. Okay, the area is very humid down there. If you've been down to tunnels, construction, you've been down, you find that actually it's a very wet, humid place working down there. Okay. Then, of course, the concern about fire risk, evacuation, do we have enough escape route? What if there's a fire and so on? And the other part, of course, is contamination. Contamination, it can be due to contamination on my construction, on my underground water supply. It can also be contamination when I use explosive, because if you're going to rock, chances are you may have to use explosive to blow it up. Explosive and residuals. If you're going to store water, then you have to worry about the contamination in your storage water, if you have residues, or if you have residues seeping into the outside and then contaminate the groundwater supply outside. Of course, you have this uncertainty due to variable geological, but I think it's not a problem because you can really manage this if you have enough site investigation and studies to show otherwise. Assessing the integrity of the underground structures. Now, this is challenging, not easy, but certainly with all the sensors and all the things that have been developed, we can make all the underground structure a smart underground, where you can actually do its own self-evaluation about the integrity and assessment, and you can actually report and sense a conditional feedback back, when you put in sensors in your underground structure. And of course, the other part, which is basically, and everything else, is just the insurance and risk assessment have to be looked into. The last talking point is actually an R&D. As I said, while the rest of the world has done a lot of work, we are still very far behind time. And that's the reason why we have this M&D R&F program, in which I co-chair with Mr. Tay Kim Po. On land and livability, first, the land indicates on how do we do space creation. Livability is, again, the quality of life. And then the Cities of Tomorrow program is just one step ahead of the one. It's looking at all the urban solution that doesn't look at just land and space, but look at energy, look at water, look at all the necessary life infrastructure that you need to sustain a city. And so there's now this City of Tomorrow program, 150 million is set aside by NRF to look into all this water, energy, and land. And these are the things. So the one that's on new space is underground space. There's a specific case here, as well as land reclamation onto here. And I think in the case of the enabling horizontal, which cut across this, there's the urban environmental analytics led by URA, HDB, and BCA. And then complexity science urban solutions led, of course, by CLC, URA, and HDB. So two of the bigger things that came out of this retreat, one of the retreat, to look at what is the big, hairy, audacious goal. One is try to reduce the construction cost by 50%. Okay, this is still a challenge thrown the industry. And then how do you have devices to monitor and surveillance underground? So these are all being actually thrown out as challenges to the industry and the university. Okay, my last few slides, uncovering the one. So if anything, I'm still trying to demystify. I hope I'm not confuse you even more about what underground is all about, but really my own vision of 50 years from now is all about livability. If you always want to use money as a reason, we will not go underground, but at some point of time, we're going to run out of space if we don't use our space optimally and possibly. So my 50 years is really touched with that livability and how do we, not necessarily that all worth it, but this is just from my own perspective. I'm quite sure each of you had your own dream of what Singapore should be like in 50 years. First of all, I think, again, the same thing. We're all pushing towards a public transport where nobody owns cars, that's the best. But with AV cars, we can have a shared green AV. LTA has done a study that shows that if we introduce AV, the whole of Singapore use AV, because the cars are able to gauge a certain distance, not like our present drivers, which are not very clever, they stop and start, so traffic doesn't move very smoothly. AV cars, they can adjust any time that you want. With AV cars, we can actually reduce our road space by 30%. That's a lot of land that we can take away if we go into AVs immediately. Then, of course, if we have a public transport, really, we can just move around in the public transport. And the AV is actually used maybe to take in the elderly, goes to do the regular weekly shopping and all this, but it's something that this will actually reduce our demand and we put all the public mode underground. Second is that, again, all of us always complain about, roads being forever been dug up and so on. And while Marina Bay showed the light that the common services does lead to very little disruption within the city, within the marina area, Not the same for the rest of the Singapore suburbs and so on. So I think at some point we have to really seriously put everything, our services, into a common service tunnel, and then we will stop all the digging and so on. That's assuming that we still have cars to move around. Okay, then if we still have cars to move around, then they've always been advocating, why do we have to, the large car parks like Suntec and Marina Bay, there are 3,000 to 5,000 car parks there. Why they have to come out to the ground, then discharge, and then go underground again, Can't they just go directly and connect to our road system? The question, if you ask me, technically is feasible, but of course there are legal and other liabilities, but to me it's not a problem. It's just a willingness, do we want to do it, or do we want not to do it? To me, this is one of the things I've been, wherever I have an opportunity to choose, and I always try to encourage that we should look at these underground cities, almost like Montreal. They hide from the cold weather, but we certainly have heat and rain we want to hide from, So is there any consequential problem of connecting Orchard Road to all by underground city or network? As I say, the area in Montreal of about 4 square kilometers is roughly the same between Orchard all the way to Marina Center, sorry. So why can't we have these all connected, the basement connected? If we cannot connect the basement, we connect to an underground series of tunnels, or in the case of Montreal, they call it the Reso. And then I never like heavy vehicles. I never like to drive next to heavy vehicles if I'm driving, but the thing is that this is actually been done now, been looked into. We can transport all our goods across the island, by the series of capsule transport through pipelines. And this has already been used in Germany, Netherlands, and Japan. Not wide scale, but they have been used. So why can't we take all the heavy containers, trucks out? Can't we take the heavy cement truck just by going through this system of network? If we're able to build a network for LRT, if I have a big tunnel, I can build a lot of things that can also include some of these transport system into it. And essentially, that's what in Changi Airport they are doing. In Changi Airport, they're just building a very large tunnel. They put in, because they have to connect between Terminal 5 and the Terminal 1, 2, 3, Terminal 2 and Terminal 5. They build a tunnel. You can people mover, bags mover, maintenance, services, utility, all in one tunnel. Why can't we do that for Singapore? And the other part of it, which I think Mr. Koo will know very well, and this one is something that we only collect about 10 to 20%, I think even less than that, less than 20% of water. This is all the rainwater, but we are not collecting it now because our catchment is shallow, we run out of space, difficulty deepening in. And this is something that proposed by Professor Louis, and I think they understand that PUB is studying it. And basically it's a series of integrating all these flood protection, stormwater, electric storage into a system underground down here. And again, this is where you integrate it with an underground system. I think this is something that PUD is starting, and I mentioned earlier on, cited 2 examples, the Hong Kong stormwater drainage and the Tokyo GCAN project. And my wish is that I always say that you want a better quality of life, put every industry that is heavy, environmental unfriendly, noisy, air odor, pollution, all put it underground, case the cost is always there. But I say you always bring cost, then we never talk about livability at all. There's nothing to put urban farming. Seriously, urban farming don't need daylight. In fact, nowadays, the urban farming done in many cities of the world just using basically LED lights. It depends on different type of plants, what type of plants you grow. They use different wavelength of the light to actually generate natural growth. This can be in underground. And then, of course, the last one is everything underground that don't need light and sky. But that doesn't mean you cannot, in the underground, bring light and sky. It's been shown in many places that you can put actually a shaft of it to bring some daylight down. It's been shown that I've seen in Montreal, you can actually bring trees inside. So these are all possibilities. I think it is a negativity that is stopping us from being imaginative and bold to move forward underground. So finally, I'd like to leave a thing to everybody here who wants to take it up, and that is to think deep. This is a movement that's in UK, and something that I've been following. It's very interesting, and that's the reason why they came up with the underground spaces unveiled by Hans and Antonio. Both of them actually were the active players in this Think Deep. It's a group of built environment experts committed to creating resilient, sustainable, livable city. They got together. It's only 2 years old. The last 2 years, they've been hosting discussion group seminars to try to see how they can combine all the planners, the engineers, the policy makers into this about thinking deep into it. And one of the active players, I think, for the URA people, is Brian Collins. So Brian Collins is an active participant in this, and Brian Collins is also on the URA International panel of experts. And so this parting message is that should we also have a Think Deep Singapore as well? Thank you.
Thank you, Prof Yong, for that very insightful, oh, wow, we have a full house, okay. For that very insightful lecture, very informative, covers a wide spectrum of issues. Let me invite Prof Yong back on stage again and the panel. Dr. Reso will be opening up to the floor for questions after the dialogue session, so please hold your questions till then. During the Q&A, please state your name, that's for later. During the Q&A session, please state your name and organization before asking questions or making comments. You might like to raise your hand so that my colleagues can actually come to you with the mic. So, Prof Yong and the panel, yeah. Dr. Reso?
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Prof, for a very comprehensive and informative presentation. We were expecting a few people. We were told that this is one of the most subscribed events that CLC have called, and we now know why. Thank you. Thank you. Of course, as an engineer, of course, I'm very proud of sitting next to a fellow engineer with such depth of knowledge and such breadth of knowledge, and that is like things that we tend to lack. We either stay broad and big picture or go deep into one subject, and Prof has been obviously an asset to Singapore and the work that he's done. He only showed part of the work. I think before we go into deeply into this discussions and questions for Prof, Adele, would you like to share a few slides with us for us here?
Okay, sure, I'll do that. My name's Adele. I'm from the URA. So we've been working on the underground planning as the next frontier. So this is our. I should get the pointer. Hold on, let me go and grab the pointer. So I thought I'd just start with a very, very short overview of what the government is doing in terms of underground planning. First, a little bit about our philosophy. So the thinking is that we want to make the best use of the space that we have, the limited space that we have, but we're not going to put everything underground. We want to be quite clear why and what we put underground. So the philosophy that governs us is we go underground where it's meaningful and feasible to do so. And how do we determine what's meaningful? We look at whether it will achieve some of these key objectives. So does it help us to optimize the use of our land and space? Does it improve the quality of our urban environment above ground? Does it help to enhance connectivity? Because when you go underground, you can connect spaces more easily together without having to follow roads and stuff like that. And also, sometimes by going underground, you actually make use of certain features like it's safer, or the environment is more easy to control, or it makes your infrastructure more resilient. So we have to think about some of these things to prioritize what we put underground. And broadly, we are also prioritizing things like utilities, transport, storage, industrial facilities, and so on. And broadly, we summarize that by borrowing a term from our Japanese friends, Gaiken, where their philosophy is to put people above ground, infrastructure underneath. So if you can't, if you take away one thing, you can think about that. Our priority is to make sure that the above ground is a very good quality living environment for people to enjoy, and then we put the things which people don't need to see, the infrastructure and stuff, underground to make the city work. So as a government, that's kind of what we want to do, but what's our role? We think we need to enable underground development in some ways. And one of the key challenges is that when you're underground, you can't see what's down there. And as Prof Yong has shared, we've actually been doing underground development for quite a while. So there's actually a lot of stuff down there. And the engineers who are building underground will tell you it's always a surprise. You know, every day you go down there and you'll find things that you never knew were there. So that's something that we want to fix in future. So we're trying to put a more systematic way of organizing the data of what's underground, and that includes things like the buildings and structures, the utility lines. Here, for example, utility lines, you often think of them as nice straight lines in orderly, parallel ways, and then when you dig the road, you find that they're, you know, crisscrossing all over. And that's a problem faced in cities all over the world. Our geology, so Singapore's geology is one of the most varied among cities, and also things like space ownership. So all that information we need to start to organize to help people plan and develop underground in future. And we're not starting with a clean slate. There's already a lot of stuff down there, but we have to start somewhere so that in 30, 40, 50 years' time, you'll have a nice, ordered underground space. The other thing that we have to think about is planning in 3D, especially when you're underground. So the picture on the left there is Marina Bay in a 2D plan. Again, kind of nice, neat straight lines. On the right gives you an idea of if you were to look underground, what are the... It's not as empty as you think. There's already a lot of stuff down there. And if you look at the little matchsticks, so those are the piles and foundations from all the buildings that are already there. Right, so that's the kind of thing that engineers and planners have to factor in when they think about going underground. And that's why we have to think in 3D. One of the key aspects of planning underground is also to organize our space underground and decide who gets the highest level, who gets the middle level, who gets to go deeper. Prof Yong has also touched a little bit on that, but the example in Marina Bay would be, give you a concrete example, would be broadly this. Again, you've got a 2D plan, lines crisscrossing of 3 key underground infrastructure, our pedestrian network, our common services tunnel with the utilities, and then our MRT tunnel. And then you can see that even on 2D, you have a lot of intersection points. So how are you going to decide who gets which level? So that's where the underground planning comes in. And then with a 3D plan and with the data in place, that's when you can start to really look at the details and say, okay, even though the space is kind of crowded and all these things are coming together, look, there's a little space there that we can still fit a tunnel in, and we can plan ahead. So a 3D underground master plan will help us do that. It will help us to coordinate users, decide which levels they should be at, safeguard corridors for the future, and also share the information so that everyone, the developers, the planners and engineers all have a common basis to work around. So that's broadly just what I want to give a flavor on. Oops, what happened there? But broadly, just to say that from the government point of view, we want to make the best use of our underground space. So for that, we need to have in place policies or sort of policy direction of what we want to do with underground. We need enablers, so that's the data and the R&D. The data and R&D, and we need forward planning from the underground planning. And I would add a last point to say that, again, in line with what Prof Yong said, we're limited only by our imagination and, in a way, financing resources and stuff like that, right? But imagination of what we could do with our underground space, and then the engineering capabilities for this. So I also want to make a pitch out there that Singapore needs engineers to, you know, see this in future.
Thank you, Dan. As Prof Yong said, I'm glad to announce that once again us engineers are leading the way in solving the problems. I don't think there's any engineering challenges that we cannot solve. It's obviously imagination, policies, cost, and other things. But Peter has been instrumental in a number of recent studies on this of underground, both in Singapore and abroad in Jakarta as well. And would you like to share some?
Sure, yeah, thanks. Thanks very much. Firstly, I'll just say thanks to the event organizers for inviting us to speak today, and for everybody turning out. Really a great turnout, which is very impressive and surprising. We heard a lot about utility lines earlier today in a couple of the talks, and I have to admit, for my sins, I'm actually a utility engineer, so I was one of the people who maybe contributed to some of the problems that are being experienced in my past life. Nowadays, I help to hopefully try and resolve those issues. So as the slide says, I'm Peter Stones, senior engineer at Arup. I've been in Singapore for about eight years, and worked on a range of projects, mostly coincidentally underground. And now I spend a lot of time involved in underground space planning projects. So I'll talk a little bit about a couple of the key aspects, some of which you'll have heard earlier on, and yeah, then we'll hand it over for questions. So I wanted to start off by saying, as the other panelists also did, that Singapore is at a certain point in its exploration of the use of underground space, and it's certainly not unique in being somewhere on that trajectory. So I'm just highlighting a couple of other cases where, you know, other countries that are on a similar journey. So on the left, I'm just highlighting a couple of cases from China, which, as Prof Yong said, is very much leading the way in this arena. And the first one I think is very interesting, taken from a conference paper earlier this month, highlighting that, as the slide says, shallow underground space in Shanghai is approaching saturation, and efforts have to be turned to utilizing the deeper underground space. So I think that just shows the degree of the problem or the issues being faced for urban underground space in China. The image on the right is taken from a newly released project in Helsinki of another, Scandinavia is very famous for these, large underground wastewater treatment facility that essentially removes the need to have the, let's say, an unpleasant wastewater treatment facility at ground level, and that space can be used for some more attractive, livable purposes. Some progress as we see it in Singapore. There's been a lot of work recently amongst many of the government agencies around understanding the underground space and what the asset is that essentially we have to play with. So I'm just highlighting one, a recent circular from the BCA and SLA, which has made publicly available information regarding borehole investigations into ground conditions. And this is the sort of progress that is really useful for engineers. It opens up that wealth of knowledge that exists across the country to inform our studies for future projects. So a great asset to have recently become available. And the image on the right, highlighting the progress that's been made tackling underground space planning up front. So we're really starting to see on a number of planning projects in Singapore and internationally, but especially in Singapore, the need and the requirement to consider what do we do with our underground space. So now when we're planning new estates, new areas, new business districts in Singapore, one of the stipulations is what are we going to do with the underground? And I think that's a key driver that the government has put in place, and I fully support that. And then lastly, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things which have been talked about as well, and what we think the future holds. I think Singapore, being where it is on its sort of trajectory of exploring and enhancing the use of underground space today, is a good thing. If we went back in time 10 or 15 years ago, the tools and the systems and the computational power available to help planners and engineers tackle these issues is not what it is today. So as the slide kind of highlights, we're at that tipping point where we can actually start to handle the complexity of underground space, the geology, the existing structures, the no doubt interwoven mess of utilities, and everything else that's down there. We can start to handle that and visualize it. And that's a really key differentiator now versus 10, 15, 20 years ago, a lot of the planning would have had to been done in 2D. And I think some of the slides earlier on sort of highlighted the value of that three-dimensional aspect to the planning work. And essentially it's the technology today that enables us to do that. So I think we're at the very opportune moment in our path of underground space use. That's my slides.
Thank you, Peter. We now have on top of the beautiful presentation that Prof made two another additional layers of information for us to collate, and I'm sure there are quite a lot of questions on your part. I use the moderator's privilege of asking I've got about 25 questions because the presentation was so beautiful. I won't use all of them. I start with one and then sort of we move hopefully to yourselves with any questions that you have. Prof, one of the questions that I've always had about going on the ground is is the ecological consequences that might have, some of which we know, some we may not know. And we tend to have this habit of doing things and then 50 years down the line realizing that there was this potential problem and things. On that front, are there any sort of studies done, anything that you foresee as might be prohibiting?
I think if I may, is to share with you, I think an interesting issue on this for the LT Cross Island project that goes under the national catchment. As you know, it's been a very major issue by those environmentalists and the Nature Society. And through the process of some of these engagement, which I had the benefit of which our LT has been having a lot of engagement in this. I was privileged to have at least 1 or 2 meetings with this NGO group. And it's very interesting because even from the LT's perspective, you open up another dimension which they have not looked at it before. Then this revolves around you do a site investigation, and it was all carefully calibrated. They are just concerned that if you drill a hole into the ground, does it actually affect the ecosystem within this, And when your tunnel is built, do you have vibration that is going to disturb all the animals and all the birds and the bees, onto that one? And with all those is where you start to think about possible solutions that you can think on this. And when we were actually, as part of the International Panel of Advisors, when we were working, we were looking all around the world, how can we do site investigation without actually putting a hole in the ground, So we look at the different methods, geophysical, and I think we even finally went into horizontal drilling, come from the site where you are allowed to access, and then in the area where you're not allowed to access so that you don't damage the forest and all the creatures and the birds and the flora that live into it. And we will do some of this, and these are sometimes, after you learn it, you know that you have another option now. You start to want to go and do some studies onto that one. And then, of course, on the other hand, we learn also from the Nature Society what is important to them, and how do you protect some of these flora and fauna species. And it's through that dialogue that you start to see how can we do things better if we want to put things underground, including the fact that we actually were trying to instrument the whole of the tunnel and to look at the vibration level. How do you dampen the tracks so that basically your vibration level getting outside of the ground, nobody knows except only those in the tunnel. And these are all technical solutions that can be done. And so these are things that the assurance that they're trying to give to the NGO that, whatever issues, they can be solved through the technical issues and going. And then the other issue that they took on is that LT actually then have to go and adjust the depth of the tunneling, basically to go into the rock. And the reason is because you go into the rock, there's less chance of what we call in the engineering term encountering mixed phase. Mixed phase is like you're encountering sometimes soil, sometimes rock, and this always have a risk that you may lead into a sinkhole and possible disturbance of the ground. And so the decision, let's go into the rock, where the chances of actually a sinkhole is probably negligible. So you try to protect the environment in that really respect, just to clever engineering solutions.
Great, thank you. Ajal, do you want to add something to that?
Well, maybe just a quick addition. So by going underground, then, especially if you can build this underground through less invasive means like bored tunnels, you can actually keep the above ground green and disturb it less. So that's one very obvious benefit of going underground.
Peter, do you want to add something about?
Just briefly, yeah, I think it's, as Adele says, it's about weighing the pros and cons of these projects. And if there's an option of an underground project which may have some ecological impacts, or an above ground project which may have some others, it's about balancing that trade-off. If it's a necessary project, which is the least bad, and then how do we mitigate the bad that's still there? So an example that LTA, I believe, undertake is seepage water that's entering the tunnels is regularly tested before it's discharged to be treated, and that's so that there's that degree of mitigation that if there is some issue, it can be fully understood and then planned accordingly.
Thank you. Thank you. So, as Prof, going into the rock also, there's less likelihood of something live existing in the actual hard rocks that could potentially be adversely affected. I think I would like to open the questions to the floor, and I'm sure there are lots of questions. If you have any, if you can, I think we've got microphones on the two sides, and I think we've got one also that can be passed on. Anyone, any questions? The gentleman at the back, yeah. If I could ask you to introduce yourself and your affiliation, and then if the question is addressed to a particular person on the panel or all of them, please.
Yeah, my name is Adrian from Asia Euro Capital. Adele mentioned just now about one of the policies is targeting towards bringing infrastructure and utilities underground. I'm just wondering what is URA's position on encouraging more commercial development underground? Are there policies, or are there going to be more policies to encourage people to build underground in a more commercial usage, in housing, more shopping malls, and so on?
Well, so our commercial developments and so on are controlled still more or less by the gross plot ratio. And we leave it to the private developers how they want to distribute the gross plot ratio. What we do is provide urban design guidelines and certain requirements. So for example, in an area like Marina Bay, we may want to connect adjacent developments to each other to create a nice pedestrian network underground. And for that, you might want also shops underground so that people aren't walking in, boring corridors. So in areas like that, we may specify that you should have commercial developments at basement at what level. For example, basement 2 at this depth, so that it'll connect nicely with the next development. We'll also have a shopping space and commercial space at this depth and so on. So we'll provide guidelines like that to guide development and make sure that the district comes out as a whole, integrated and coordinated. That's broadly what we will do. In terms of incentives, we don't provide incentives in that sense. What we do is we have a cash grant incentive for underground connections between buildings to create, again, that nice network in a particular area. So the cash grant is provided to help defray the construction cost of providing these underground links. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? So while you're thinking, I raise another one of my 25 questions. We were, as it happens, last week or a few weeks ago, a couple of weeks ago with Lilac as well, we were sorry, on a panel looking at some research work done by some NUS students on self-sufficiency in Singapore and the plans for it in terms of power, food, waste, etc. And one of the things that came up was, and you mentioned in your presentation, Prof, water and storage of water, and how about 80% of the water that we could be collecting in the sort of water scarce Singapore and the world is sort of in effect being wasted. I suppose part of it goes back into the into the sort of groundwater and stabilize this thing, but we could be harvesting more. And underground would be a great source for that. And the things happening on that front as well, Prof. And any more that you can talk to us about?
I'm sure Ting Chai will know more. He's just keeping quiet. My own sense is that if we really look at the water situation, and I'm not selling for PUB, but it's all in their vocabulary. There are 4 taps, 4 national taps, okay? Our normal catchment, our desalination plant, and our new water. Right now, new water actually, I believe is about 40–50% of the water is from new water. About desalination now is probably about 25%, but with the new ones coming in, they're probably up to 30%. That leaves the rest of it to become from our catchment, of which, meaning water from the runoff, of which, if I can recollect, 50% of that in the catchment is about 25% to 30% of the water. Half of it comes from our own catchment, half of it comes from the Johor. And all of us know that come to probably 2045 or so, I think, this treaty is going to expire, and where are we going to get all those water? So we need to consider how do we make up for the shortfall now, and that's to start to increase our ability to retain water in catchment. So with all our catchment that we have, I say we only have about 10 to 20%, we can actually, through a series without deepening the reservoir and causing a lot of disturbance, as what probably is suggested, to look at a series of interconnected cable. Can they do 2 purposes? One is actually, as I say, to solve our stormwater collection during the area of peak rainfall, and the other is try to keep as much water as we can. That can either be used for hydroelectric purpose, the sustainability again, or actually to use as a storage when we hit the drought. Now, my own understanding, a little work on climate action, because that's another thing that I was interested in, sustainability, is that I was told that our drought actually sometimes forecast is that it may be actually possible for Singapore to experience no rain for up to 3 months. Now, that's where you're going to stress the system, because really at this point of time, when it dries, doesn't rain, your catchment is all dry. And it's what we've seen in the Johor catchment area. They were dry during the period of when there's no rain of it. So we need to develop some sort of self-sufficiency rather than be depending, and we are good at that, and I think my sense is that at some point in time we're going to have this underground storage.
Thank you. Please.
I'm Liak Ting Lit. I'm not an engineer, so if you may, can you allow me to ask a stupid question?
There's no such thing as stupid questions, only stupid answers, but you won't get one from here.
All infrastructure will come a time when you need to do either major replacement or repair. For example, the tunnel for our train. How do you do that? Because when the train is running and everybody depending on that line, how can you handle that?
The good thing is Singapore is young. Our infrastructure is still relatively young, although we're now talking about aging infrastructure. The fact is that many cities ahead of us are already in that direction. London, New York, all of them have this problem. You can actually repair and actually retrofit tunnels. The only difference is that right now our lines are all run almost, I would say, to capacity, where the period of maintenance is actually very little. In London, they can close 1 line or 2 lines just to do the repairs, maintenance, and refurbishment of that to bring it up. But they have other stations they can go through. So they're not just dependent 1 line. They close 1 line, they can still walk within the other line. We need to create that density, that if 1 line shuts down, we don't get paranoid. We can just go to another area. So this can be done. It's not something new. Technology is there. It's no different from all the while we're asking, how do we replace the sewer pipes underground that's going to be placed there? And again, people have created, again, before us, this system where the sewer pipe is all corroded, all rotten up already in the ground. They basically created, again, this autonomous kind of technique and go in, and then they change the whole piping in the one. So technology is there. It's only at some point in time we probably have to use it in Singapore as well.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just add to that one. I think for a lot of infrastructure that's, just with my utility background again, for utility lines, we find that infrastructure ages in funny ways. So things like the advent of fiber optics kind of changed the nature of telecommunication infrastructure, and maybe we're seeing another generation or another transformational change like that with the advent of 5G connectivity. And so I think there's other aspects to that issue, not just the physical age of the infrastructure, but really the appropriateness of the technology, particularly with telecom lines, for example. So I think it's a very interesting question, and again, we're lucky that we are where we are in this kind of timeline, that we have the opportunity to learn from some of these other places that are sort of a little bit ahead in terms of their aging infrastructure, and learn from their best practices and what can be done. And again, I think that's something that that Singapore and the URA in particular do very, very well, is this kind of horizon scanning to assess and to keep up with the game, essentially.
Thank you. I'm told that we've only got, unfortunately, another 5 minutes to go. So if there are any questions, please let them come in, because otherwise you're going to regret not having used the opportunity to be asking questions. That gentleman there, please.
I am Tan Shi Tiong. I'm a practicing architect and town planner, and also adjunct professor at NUS. Few years ago, there are two young engineers in New York has invented a project called Low Line. I wonder some of you have heard of it. It's very interesting, just using very cheap parabolic mirror, collect the sunlight, let the light go through the optic fiber, and then shines into the basement of a disused traction company's depot. So I thought today the major issue about underground is about energy consumption, which definitely will be much higher than on ground. So do we see hope in this sort of passive energy approach towards underground construction, that eventually you could make underground spaces even livable, meaning for housing? Thank you.
Thank you. Prof, you had some examples of that, and if I may just add one sentence, I was having a look at a presentation of your project in Istanbul, where there's a multi-story shopping retail, which is built on the ground. And when we look at the spaces on the inside, you wouldn't feel that you're below ground. So definitely, as you said, the technology is there, the ingenuity of architects and designers are there to be making spaces below ground, which would not feel necessarily like a cave and things. But in terms of the technologies and the cost that was mentioned, are we almost there? I must say I wasn't 100% sure about the cost. If you take a holistic view of what the cost of a development is, whether overall, over a period of time, whether going below ground would cost less or would cost more.
I'll answer the first part about cost first, and I think, as I mentioned, basically when land price goes up, if you talk about overall cost, yes, because what I've shown is just the actual construction. So construction may go up. In fact, actually, I think in future construction go down because of better technology, but the land will certainly go up. So you find the overall cost in the future actually make more sense, just like what the Japanese have found, is actually to go underground. It makes more sense for them than not to make full use of that land. But I come on this part about lighting and all this. Yes, I've been to the high line. I also been to the low line. Both of them are just very clever use of unused space. I think you leave it to some of these people, they actually can make what used to be old junk places, areas that are not habitable, to very habitable. But one thing that they have and we don't have, I still think is, and you pointed out, is basically still the climate. You go to high line, low line, except for winter, most of the time it's nice just to walk on the high line. Similarly, the low line is also very nice to walk through, and all they need is just light, and that's what they're very clever at bringing down the light. And I've shown the examples like Montreux and everywhere else. If you want to make sure that people do not get disoriented, there's always a lot of opportunities to bring in lights into it. Although I'm always reminded that sometimes, because of a heavy rain, when you design the skylights, okay, there's a place where it's always leak, unless you actually are very good in detailing all those things actually. Otherwise, that is a natural. People also are divine using, as you pointed out, mirrors, just reflect, you go into it. We actually have studied that before. Now, in terms of cooling the system, my own sense is that if it's a transient movement, you don't need the kind of air conditioning that we are seeing nowadays. There are some research going on, both at university as well as in ICT engineering, to looking at how to make the air cool without actually going through the same compression air system that your currently have. You know, where they try to use a system that's actually now, at least they envisage, and that's what they told me, is 1/10 of what the air conditioning costs go. But this is not commercialized. There's still issues to be looked into at a commercial, but they're actually, I think they are moving in the right direction. If you want to make transit station, just cool, but don't have to be air conditioned.
Thank you. Peter, do you want to say?
I think to the question around energy and sort of the life cycle costs or benefits, I think in terms of energy efficiency, it very much depends where the development is located, as Prof Yong was kind of was hinting at, that in temperate climates there can be sort of climatic benefits to being below ground. You get that constant temperature of the underground space across the year. Therefore, you need less heating in less cooling in summer, less heating in winter. In very tropical climates, that same sort of story doesn't quite hold true, because as I understand it, our annual temperature variation is a lot smaller, and our underground space temperature variation is not so different from our ambient air temperature. So the question of that sort of heating and cooling benefit, I think, very much depends exactly on where you're located. In terms of energy efficient systems, I think we're constantly now looking to reinvent and innovate the next most energy efficient way. So LED lighting was part of that story. Now natural day lighting is also part of that story. So I think, again, it's a timeline, and where we are is sort of pushing towards that tipping point of becoming, meeting those kind of needs.
Just a small addition to the conversation on this. We do see a lot of very interesting uses of underground space in other cities. And often we get asked, how come Singapore isn't doing that? You know, how come we aren't putting farms underground and swimming pools underground and so on? So I think firstly is understanding the context. So as Peter mentioned, the weather is one, the water table is another, where the good geology or the good rocks are is another aspect. And then the other key thing to bear in mind is that a lot of these very interesting ideas are making use of disused underground space. So the hole was already created for some other purpose, the Cold War and so on and so forth. And then that use was no longer needed, so there was an underutilized space, so all these users could then just go in, and it became a cheap space to do these things. So we have to look at the economics of each project, the feasibility of each project on its own terms. And if it's about creating, spending money to dig a hole to grow mushrooms, it may not make sense. If the hole were already there and you just need to move your mushroom farm in, then the economics will be quite different. So I think that's also just something to think about, when you look at the social media and all these interesting videos about how other people are doing underground space. This gives you an additional lens to bear in mind.
Yeah, thank you. I guess you might have another question on the basis of what you just said about food. Yes.
Can I
please
not ask a stupid question, but maybe a stupid suggestion? Prof Yong, Tanjong Pagar, it will be our next future city, right? That we're going to develop the next maybe 40, 50 years. If we were to do your mother of all tunnel from Changi Airport all the way to the new Tanjong Pagar town, city, and we dig out all this soil and all this thing, will it be enough to do some of the landfill that we couldn't do because we don't have sand? And would that make the economics a bit more sensible?
Well, first of all, if you talk about using that for reclamation, now we're going to deeper depth. For every square meter in the past, you basically, depth water is 5 to 10 meters. Now you're talking about 30 to 40 meters. So the volume of fill, even you dig all the way from Changi to Tanjung Pagar, if you're in the big tunnel, is not sufficient to do even a lot of the reclamation. Even you dig from Changi all the way to Tuas to connect the airport and the port, whatever it takes is still not enough for the massive amount of reclamation volume that we actually need. Because in Tuas, really very deep, I see a person who's in charge of the Tuas port here, but basically the volume of amount of material is just huge because we are basically going to 30 to 40 meters of water.
But then we will have a super efficient movement of goods underground and everything else.
If it's for that purpose, okay. If it's just to look for the materials to fill up the one, it's not enough. But basically, if you ask me, that will actually be something that is really worth seriously to consider. Because at some point in time, we should actually look at this for the long term, not for basically for current use.
Sure. Thank you for that question. One point about the issue of food and the fancy photographs that one sees on social media, etc. See, if going down is for food, for things which are of strategic importance for the country, for self-sufficiency, etc., how does one cost those things? How expensive is it for us to be getting food when those who are supposed to be giving it to us decide not to give it to us, and what happens on week 3?
Well, that is something that we think about. Actually, I mean, Peter and I were laughing because we worked on the joint URA Arab study on underground, and one of the big issues that we discussed was how do you evaluate underground projects? How do you do a cost-benefit analysis for underground projects, factoring in aspects such as strategic benefits? You know, not necessarily just the capital cost or the maintenance cost, but just all these intangibles or these risks. You know,
so when those two curves cross in terms of land value, I think. Prof, did you want to say something on concluding remarks? We are almost out of time, I'm afraid, so won't have time for more questions.
I think, as I say, the intention actually when I put it is to uncover the underground, just to make sure that basically they're not mysterious, that we know there's a space there. At some point in time, we probably have to see how to make good use of the space. And I agree that in some case, the URA has been, in all their master plan, be trying to see how to intensify, try to make use of land more efficiently above the ground before I go underground. But because I've been so involved in underground and I see that all the challenges that we are putting, you know, without a clear plan, it's going to be a struggle for in 50 years' time to come. Because right now, we're already facing a struggle. Not that engineering solutions cannot do it. The fact is that you have to spend more, the risk is higher when you try to navigate your new structure among all the existing structure. I think the right thing to do is to have a plan, safeguard the area, and some point we are going to do. And the other thing I've always been suggesting, and I'm not, I may be stepping on the stepping on the toes of some people who are looking at this policy, is that there are two things that I always ask to see whether they can review. One is the development charge below ground, you know. It cannot be the same as the development charge above, because then there's little incentive for people to want to go underground. Second is that as much as possible, you look at the cost not from today's cost. If you want to evaluate the financial feasibility, you look at the cost 50, 100 years' time, because that is what the cost is going to do if you're going to start building all the things above ground. Then later on you come to the below ground, it's going to be so expensive at this stage. So you should start to look at the cost below, because as I say, Singapore is young. We learn from the experience of more countries that have reached that. Tokyo has reached that destination point, but the land is so expensive that everything goes underground makes sense to them.
Thank you. I think that leaves me time to thank Prof, Adele, and Peter, and thank you all for being here, and let's show our appreciation for the speakers and the tremendous amount of